Chicago, February 14th, 1929, 10:30 a.m. Four men, two dressed as police officers, enter a garage on North Clark Street. 7 members of the rival North Side gang are lined up against a brick wall. They think it's a routine police raid. They are wrong. Moments later, the air is filled with the rattle of Thompson's submachine guns. 70 rounds later, the floor is red. This was the St. Valentine's Day massacre. It was the moment Al Capone stopped being a businessman and became public enemy number 1. He was the man who turned Prohibition into a gold mine, pulling in $100 million a year, while the rest of America was in the breadlines of the Great Depression. He didn't just sell alcohol. He owned the city. He bought the mayors. He hired the police, and he terrorized the streets. But for all his violence, the law couldn't touch him for murder. They had to get creative. This is the story of the most famous gangster in history. From the scars on his face to the quiet madness of his final days, this is the story of Al Capone. Alphonse Capone was an unlikely candidate for the throne of American organized crime. Born in Brooklyn to law-abiding Neapolitan immigrants, he lacked the noble criminal lineage of the old-world mafia. However, the path to infamy began with a flash of the temper that would later define his reign. A bright student at a Catholic school, Capone's formal education ended abruptly in the 6th grade when he punched a teacher. This act of rebellion pushed him into the streets, where he joined the notorious 5 Points gang. It was in the shadows of the Manhattan slums that Capone met the most influential figure of his life, Johnny the Fox Torrio. Unlike the thuggish street fighters of the era, Torrio was a strategist. He saw potential in the young, sturdy Capone and took him under his wing as an apprentice. Torrio's lessons were revolutionary for the time. He didn't just teach Capone how to use his fists or a Tommy gun. He taught him professionalism. Torrio's core philosophies were the corporate mask, always maintain the appearance of a legitimate businessman, diplomacy over violence, war is expensive, peace is profitable, violence should only be used as a last resort when negotiations fail. The power of the suit, a clean, expensive appearance buys respect and distracts the authority. Under Torrio, Capone transitioned from a street hoodlum to a sophisticated operative. He learned to manage accounts, bribe officials, and organize protection rackets like a corporate executive. This business-first mentality would eventually allow Capone to take over Chicago, proving that the most dangerous weapon in a gangster's arsenal wasn't a pistol, it was a ledger. In 1917, long before he ruled the Chicago skyline, Al Capone was just a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island. It was here that a single moment of disrespect changed his face and his legacy forever. After Capone made a crude remark to a young woman, her brother, a small-time hood named Frank Galusio, took offense. Galusio pulled a knife and slashed Capone 3 times across his left cheek and jaw. The wounds healed into jagged, permanent reminders of the altercation. The underworld and the press quickly dubbed him Scarface, a moniker that stuck with him for the rest of his life. Paradoxically, the man who would later order the deaths of dozens was deeply sensitive about his appearance. The cover-up. Capone loathed the nickname. In professional portraits, he insisted on being photographed from the right side to hide the disfigurement. The war hero lie. To the public, he often spun a heroic yarn, claiming the scars were shrapnel wounds received while fighting with the Lost Battalion in France during World War I, despite the fact that he had never served in the military. This obsession with his scars revealed an early glimpse into Capone's psychological makeup. He understood that in the world of power, perception is reality. He didn't want to be seen as a common street brawler who lost a fight in a bar. He wanted to be viewed as a statesman of the underworld or a veteran of the state. In 1919, the education of Al Capone moved to the big leagues. His mentor, Johnny Torrio, had moved to Chicago to help his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, manage a massive network of brothels and gambling dens. Sensing a storm on the horizon, Torrio summoned Capone to act as his right-hand man. Capone arrived in the Windy City just as the 18th Amendment was ratified. Overnight, the noble experiment of Prohibition turned the manufacturing and sale of alcohol into a criminal goldmine. Big Jim Colosimo was a man of the old world. He was content with his vice empire and refused to enter the risky, violent world of bootlegging. Torrio and Capone, however, saw a billion-dollar opportunity passing them by. The hit. On May 11, 1920, Big Jim was gunned down in his own cafe. While never proven in court, most historians believe Capone was the triggerman or the architect. The takeover. With the old guard out of the way, Torrio and Capone stepped into the power vacuum. They didn't just sell beer, they industrialized the process. Under the banner of the Chicago outfit, the duo began a rapid expansion. They didn't see themselves as thugs, but as wholesalers filling a market demand that the government had foolishly made illegal. Capone moved from being a bouncer to a chief operating officer, managing a supply chain of secret breweries, trucking fleets, and a small army of enforcers. They proved that in the 1920s, the quickest way to the American dream was through a barrel of illegal whiskey. Al Capone was more than a mobster. He was a pioneer of vertical integration. Years before modern corporations perfected the model, Capone realized that middlemen were a liability. To maximize profit and minimize risk, he decided that the Chicago outfit should own every single step of the process. If a customer drank a glass of beer in Chicago, Capone wanted to have touched the grain, the barrel, the truck, and the tap. Capone restructured the traditional street gang into a sophisticated business hierarchy. He replaced chaotic violence with a rigid corporate ladder, the supply chain. He purchased secret breweries, hired expert chemists to cut the alcohol, and operated a fleet of armored delivery trucks. The retailers. He owned or taxed thousands of speakeasies, ensuring that his product was the only one available on the shelf. The human resources. Capone was known for his generosity. He paid his men significantly higher wages than legitimate jobs offered and provided for the families of those who went to prison. Al Capone was a master of psychological warfare, and he understood that his greatest shield wasn't a bulletproof vest, it was public opinion. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Chicago was devastated. While the government struggled to provide relief, Capone saw a strategic opening. He opened one of the city's first and largest soup kitchens, serving 3 meals a day to thousands of unemployed citizens. By 1929, Al Capone was the undisputed king of Chicago, with one glaring exception, George "Bugs" Moran and his North Side gang. The two had been locked in a blood feud for years over territory and hijacked shipments. Capone, vacationing in Florida to maintain an alibi, ordered a strike designed to decapitate Moran's leadership once and for all. It was meant to be a surgical hit. Instead, it became the most infamous slaughter in American criminal history. On the morning of February 14th, 4 men, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers, entered a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. 7 of Moran's associates, believing it was a routine police raid, lined up against the brick wall with their hands up. The officers then opened fire with Thompson's submachine gun. More than 70 rounds were fired in seconds. In a final, gruesome touch, the killers walked out casually to their squad car, making witnesses believe the police had simply made a successful arrest. While the hit broke the North Side gang, Moran famously remarked, "Only Capone kills like that." It shattered Capone's carefully crafted PR image. The Robin Hood persona vanished overnight, replaced by the image of a bloodthirsty monster. The public outcry. For the first time, the citizens of Chicago were truly revolted by the violence. The federal response. The headlines reached the White House. President Herbert Hoover, embarrassed by the lawlessness, famously told his Treasury Secretary, "I want that man in jail." The massacre didn't just kill 7 mobsters. It killed the public's tolerance for the cocaine cowboy era of the 1920s and painted a giant federal bullseye on Capone's back. With President Hoover's mandate, the federal government launched a sophisticated pincer movement to dismantle the Chicago outfit. This wasn't a standard police investigation. It was a war of attrition on 2 fronts. The first front was high profile and loud, led by a 26-year-old Prohibition agent named Elliot Ness. He handpicked a small squad of agents known for their incorruptibility, the untouchables, Ness and the Muscle. Ness understood that the outfit's power came from its cash flow. He used customized 10-ton trucks equipped with steel cow catchers to smash through the doors of Capone's multi-million-dollar breweries. The raids. Ness and his team seized over $1 million worth of brewing equipment and thousands of gallons of illegal beer. The PR war. Ness was a media darling. By constantly appearing in the news with his untouchables, he kept Capone's attention focused on the street-level violence and the physical security of his booze, the green eye shades. While Capone was busy fighting Ness in the streets, a quiet team of IRS Intelligence Unit investigators, led by Frank Wilson, was working in the shadows. These men didn't carry submachine guns. They carried ledgers. They spent years meticulously combing through seized records, bank statements, and the testimony of disgruntled bookkeepers. They were looking for the one thing Capone couldn't hide: his unreported income. Capone had never filed a tax return, famously claiming he had no taxable income. Wilson's team discovered a special ledger that proved Capone was pocketing millions, while the government got nothing. Capone underestimated the bookkeepers. He believed that as long as he couldn't be linked to a murder, he was safe. He didn't realize that in the eyes of the law, a missing signature on a tax form was just as dangerous as a smoking gun. While Ness humiliated Capone publicly, the IRS was quietly building the cage that would eventually hold him. Al Capone was a ghost in the financial system. He dealt exclusively in cash, used aliases for property, and never once signed a check or opened a bank account in his own name. He operated under the arrogant assumption that if there was no paper trail, there was no crime. However, IRS agent Frank Wilson, a man so dedicated he once spent 3 straight years living in a Chicago hotel to avoid Capone's hitmen, knew that even the most chaotic empire needs an accountant. The breakthrough didn't come from a high-stakes raid, but from a dusty box of seized records from a 1926 raid on the Hawthorne Hotel, Capone's headquarters. While combing through mundane receipts, Wilson found a special ledger. It was a meticulously kept record of the profits from a massive gambling den. On one page, the bookkeeper had made a fatal error. He had explicitly written the name Al next to a payout of $32,000. To a normal person, it was just a number. To the IRS, it was the smoking gun. It provided the first direct written link between Scarface and the taxable income he claimed he didn't have. Wilson didn't just need the book, he needed the men who wrote it. He tracked down the outfit's former bookkeepers, Leslie Shumway and Fred Rice, who were hiding in fear for their lives. Wilson promised them government protection in exchange for their testimony. They confirmed the ledger's authenticity and testified that Al was indeed Alphonse Capone. This $32,000 entry was the crack in the dam. Once the IRS proved Capone had received any income, the burden of proof shifted. If he had $32,000 in gambling profits, how could he afford $5,000 custom suits, a fleet of armored Cadillacs, and a palm-fringed estate in Florida? By failing to pay taxes on that single entry, Capone had committed a federal felony. The man who couldn't be caught for 100 murders was finally trapped by a single line of ink. In 1931, the federal government finally achieved what no street rival could. They removed Al Capone from the board. Sentenced to 11 years for tax evasion, he was initially sent to Atlanta, where he managed to live like a king by bribing guards for cigars, fine furniture, and even a radio. However, the government had one last move. The final act of Al Capone's life played out far from the machine gun fire of Chicago, in the sweltering heat of his mansion on Palm Island, Florida. Released from prison as a mental and physical invalid, the man who once controlled a $100 million a year empire was now a ward of his wife, May. The late-stage neurosyphilis had eroded his mind so completely that the big fellow could no longer distinguish between the present and his blood-soaked past. Capone's final years were a haunting spectacle of a shattered psyche. He would spend hours sitting by his swimming pool, casting a fishing line into the chlorinated water, waiting for a bite that would never come. Visitors and staff reported that he would hold animated, one-sided conversations with guests who weren't there. Many believed he was talking to the ghosts of his rivals, men like Jaime Weiss or the victims of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The man who had used terror to silence others was now haunted by the silent voices in his own head. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a massive heart attack, followed by a stroke. He died at age 48, an old man in a young man's body. His death marked the final tax collected by a life of excess and violence. He wasn't gunned down in the street or executed by the state. He was slowly dismantled from the inside out by his own choices and the cold machinery of federal law. Capone's life proved a chilling reality of the American legal system. The government might fail to convict you for 100 murders, but it will eventually find a ledger, a tax form, or a prison cell to collect your soul. He redefined crime as a corporate venture, but in the end, he was a cautionary tale. He died in a haze of dementia, leaving behind a name that remains synonymous with power, but a life that ended in total, hollow silence.